Hello, welcome back to Janus Academy. This is the series of lectures on general history of art, introduction to history of art. We're going to be dealing with 52 lectures where each of them represents one artifact, and through that one artifact we are discussing a certain period, a certain era in most cases, that we are interested in. Today we're going to be talking about a very curious item known as Venus of Berekhat Ram. The previous item we were discussing was the Venus of Tantan, and it was found in Morocco. This one is found in, Berekhat Ram, which is a part of Levant, the part of today's Golan Heights. The item is kept in a museum, that is very close to the same location. The item that we're going to be talking about is very small. Actually, I think it's the smallest one that we've discussed thus far. And as it was noted in the previous lectures, this has a very specific reason. We are still talking about nomadic lifestyle. We are talking about the fact that humans cannot build large objects. They cannot carry large objects. We don't have the means to. So all of the things that we make are very, very small. They're not burdensome or cumbersome at all. This particular pebble really is a scoria pebble, which means that it's made of volcanic stone. It's a highly porous pyrite, if I'm not mistaken. It's 3.5 centimeters long, 2.5 centimeters wide, and 2.1 centimeters thick. It's really tiny. It's like this big, basically, perhaps a bit more than that. Yeah. And it weighs approximately 10 grams, which again, it's tiny. Now, this was discovered fairly recently. Again, it was excavated in 1981 in the Acheulean site of Berekhat Ram. So it's a fairly recent discovery, and I find this very interesting. This is something we didn't really mention when we were talking about the previous artifact, the Venus of Tamtam, and something we did mention in our history of art series and on what is art, where we were talking on one end about different ideas of what is art and how it relates to different eras. Now, this is quite important because we mentioned this famous essay written by T.S. Eliot, where he argues that every next work of art, he was talking about literature, but I think it's applicable to all the other arts of art in general, that is added to what we consider the canon, changes the entirety of the canon. So even if we add a work of art that is recently created, all of the works of art that exist in that canon become influenced by that latest edition, and then we read all of them differently on account of that edition. Now, this is, very applicable in this particular case because we're talking, again, about a fairly recent discovery that is dated very far to the past. We're talking about a time frame anywhere between 280 and 250,000 years. Now, this is a lot. This is really, really old. Again, this is way older than anything we could rightfully suggest to be our civilization. But what is really important is that it falls within what we consider to be the dawn of humanity, the dawn of the Homo sapiens stage of development of humanity. That is to say that when we're talking about this particular artifact, we can assume with fair certainty that it was made by Homo sapiens, not Homo erectus or Australopithecus. This is a very important thing because if we're talking about the development of humanity, we're talking about different capacities. We're talking about, in a way, different minds, different brains, different bodies. Everything changes. And what we're going to try and do today is basically establish just how much of an advancement, or if we can attest any advancement at all, is visible in this particular take, in this particular artifact. Yet again, we are calling a piece of stone a Venus, and the reason why we do that is this, a somewhat controversial practice from the 19th century to name all of the naked ladies Venuses. It's that simple and it's that banal, even when they have nothing to do with the cult of Venus whatsoever. This is too old to have anything to do with the cult of Roman goddess Venus or its predecessors like Greek goddess Aphrodite or the Babylonian goddess Ishtar. It has nothing to do with that. But what is interesting is that its location would indicate that, at least geographically, it would have something to do with that, because Babylon is situated was situated not that far away from where this particular item was located, only, there's 250,000 years of difference in between. With that one little caveat, with that one small exception, we can say that broadly speaking, this is the similar geography. not quite the same. Now, when I say that it's a similar geography, I am referring to the fact that the area that is broadly known as Levant nowadays, or the Middle East, was a part of the so-called Fertile Crescent. And this is something that we're going to be coming back to again and again and again. This idea that civilization as we know it emerged from this particular place, because this was, well, green, it was fertile. It was a place where humans discovered the mastery of agriculture. Therefore, it was the place where first cities appeared, and then everything else that came from it. Now, again, a small caveat, all of this happened 2050 years after this statuette was made. So yeah, something to be addressed, but it's nonetheless interesting that we are getting closer, geographically speaking, to the part of the world that will have our attention for thousands of years later. The part of the world where important things start happening, like the, well, Neolithic agricultural revolution, and then with it, everything else that follows. The whole idea of this particular object is that it is no longer a manuport. It is something that was created by humans, or it was partially created and partially shaped as it was. So now we are talking about yet another level, an added level of agency. We are talking about something that is more worked and more shaped than the previous two items. This is something that follows the basic schema of development, and that is really important. If we're talking about this particular artifact as some sort of a proto-work of art, and we are, because this is the whole series on history of art, we are talking about this whole idea of engagement and action and materializing an abstract notion. We are talking about the capacity of abstract thought that then comes to action. Now, this is really important because when we are doing so, we are talking about the levels of separation from nature. And this is tremendously important for our current period of time. This is important for the general scope of Romanticism, because of these theories that exist that we are still in the period of Romanticism. Although we consider our current period to be postmodern, there are theories that claim that it's all Romanticism. It always has been, and it will be for another 300 years. The point is that separation from nature is what is incredibly, well, important, a really big deal when we're talking about a nascent humanity, when we're talking about forming of what is human, and when we're talking about the tragic condition of a human. This is something that was, thought about and analyzed and theorized by, many thinkers in Europe, people like Rousseau, people like Nietzsche, like then Freud, Jung. I mean, all these incredibly influential thinkers were thinking about how we are separated from nature, what good it brought us, what ill it brought us, and how we are different in this particular manner from all the other animals because we have self-awareness that we assume that animals do not have, and we know that we are separated from nature. We are not a part of this, holobiont, if you will, or a large ecosphere. We have societies, whereas animals, wild animals, tend to live in nature. Now, of course, we have domesticated a lot of animals, so they too live in a society. They live in our society. They form their own societies. Of course, animals have their own societies, but they're all a part of nature. So these are different kingdoms, if you will, different realms. And we go back to this particular object where we assume that it is worked upon more so, I would dare say much more so, than the other two objects that we were discussing, and that this is basically a sign of our separation from nature. Now, there was a certain level of controversy about if this, on the topic, if this was a manuport or if this was created. And you can see how this is a very important topic. If we're talking about this as a work of art or a proto-work of art, or work of proto-art, if you prefer, this is really important for us to establish. Is this something that we found in nature and then recognized as such, or is this something that we intentionally created? For the moment, the general consensus seems to be that it was created rather than recognized. When we think about what was created, we should really, there will be an image of this as I'm talking about it, but we should give a description of what we're looking at. We're looking at a very small pebble that I personally think looks very cute. It's just incredibly endearing. It's small and chubby, and it's very sympathetic. But the point is that we are starting to see certain traits emerging. We are starting to see something that was not visible before or was not visible to the same extent. Now, it is up to you to compare this object to what was previously shown in our other lecture when we were talking about Venus of Tantan, and to establish if this is really worth the development that happened over 200,000 years. Is the jump from that image of a woman adequate, given the chronology, well, to this? Could we have developed, well, more or differently? I think it's important to mention, to go back to something we mentioned in the previous lecture when we were talking about the Acheulean hand axe, that this was a tool that was used for over 1.5 million years. And this is something that is, well, striking. I mean, 1.5 million years, that's a lot. That's a lot of time. That we didn't really think that we should change this tool. It was perfectly adequate for whatever we wanted to do. Now, we think of today's world, contemporary period. This is being filmed in February of 2026. We can see existence of a notion of planned obsolescence. That certain tools or certain, well, gadgets, objects, let's say cell phones or computers, are made to age drastically fast because we are expected to buy new ones. We want to buy as many things so that people who are selling these things can have enough money to make new things that we can then also buy. So there's this whole idea of consumerist necessity of purchase and of, well, consumption, so that the economy continues working as it is, and as it does. But the point is that if we go back in time, we see that the development happens much slower. We are not talking about technology that changes generations within years. We are talking about technology that doesn't change over hundreds of years or thousands of years or indeed millions of years. Because again, this axe that we're taking as an example did not change for 1.5 million years. This is to say that development or progress, or call it what you will, advancement of technology, that it may not be progress at all. You should go back to Freud's essay and read it and understand why this may not be progress at all. Happens very, very slowly, and that there is this, very, very slow accumulation of knowledge and of capacity, of productive capacity, that then absolutely explodes in the eve of the Industrial Revolution. And then from that moment on, our technology gets developed with insane speed. It gains incredible velocity seemingly all of a sudden. But the point I'm trying to make here is that the further we go back to the past, the slower development is. And the further we go back to the past, we see less and less of development, the slower it gets. Something that would make sense for us to change in, let's say, 20 or 30 years took hundreds of thousands of years. And that's, drastic. But another point needs to be made when we're talking about these artifacts and when we're talking about tools, is that people that were using those did not necessarily have to change them because they were not challenged to do so, because they had tools that were perfectly fine for them. They were adequate. Now, in most cases, people would not change their tools and therefore their environment and therefore themselves and therefore their notion of art, again, as rudimentary, as anachronistic as this may be, talking about art 250,000 years ago, they would not change unless they had to, unless they were challenged by a set of circumstances, or unless they were challenged by, let's say, a different tribe that would move into their vicinity. This is when we start seeing development, when there are clashes, and when there are incentives that come from this for, invention, for usage of different, more advanced tools. They come from being exposed to other tribes, to being exposed to more people. But if we have roaming groups of people who are nomadic and who don't really come across a lot of other people, who don't really come across a lot of other people in a systematic manner, then they don't really have a lot of incentive to change. And that means that they can take their, sweet time with development of themselves and the world around them. If we're looking at this subject, we can say that there are specific features that are advanced in comparison to the previous one that we discussed, Venus of 1010. We can say, for example, that features are better defined. We can say with greater certainty that this is a human body, and we can say with greater certainty that it's a female body. This is something that's going to be very important. We're going to be talking about it later on, the sensual nature of female representation. Now, one thing that is incredibly important, at least to me personally when I'm talking about this, is the facial representation and how we can start observing facial features. This is a really big deal because in the previous lecture we were talking about how the first lecture was about a face that was a manuport. Then the second one was about a body that was mostly a manuport but had some agency added to it, whereas this one is not really a manuport, it's a fashioned item that has a human face. The first one was all face, the second one was all body. This one is body and face combined. So the moment where those two come together and produce a synthesis of something that is exceptional. Now, of course, I'm possibly overselling this. It's exceptional if we properly situate it in its own period, but it may seem rudimentary from this particular point of view. The face is not incredibly realistic. We can tell that, well, we see a nose that is defined, and then we see something that could be a couple of eyes. I think it's a fairly safe assumption to say that we're looking at two eyes and a nose. Very different disposition, very different arrangement than Makapansgat's pebble. But let's say that when it comes to the body, it's more similar to, well, the body of Venus of Temtem. Now, this one doesn't really seem to have defined arms. It does have very defined legs, and it does have a much more voluptuous form. A very, very important thing that we're going to go back to. Now, if you're talking about the absence of arms, you are then thinking about the famous figurine Venus of Willendorf, again, upper Paleolithic series of Venuses that are in no way connected to these particular ones that come from Michulian period. So there's hundreds of thousands of years separating them, and we call them Venuses both. So yeah, there's a bit of confusion there. But the point is that Venus of Willendorf has very, very small, very tiny arms that she holds over her breasts. Those arms are incredibly tiny and frail as compared to the general disposition, the body of a very curvy, very round woman. Here, at least from what I can tell, I don't see any arms at all, but I see a much more generous figure, a much more round and indeed a voluptuous figure. Now, I want to go back to this whole story of where we found this and the fact that we found it in what would later, much later, hundreds of thousands of years later, become the site of the Fertile Crescent, because we have this idea of vision of the world that is very different for a nomadic tribe as it is from a sedentary tribe. We have nomadic people who mostly do hunting and gathering and foraging. And then we have sedentary people who mostly do agriculture and animal husbandry. They have different worldviews. This is quite obvious. It doesn't really need to be explained that much because they have different lives. They use different tools. They have entirely different bodies and physiques. Their consciousnesses are entirely different because they're exposed to different challenges. But the point is that there is this whole question of voluptuousness and fertility. We're going to be talking about that in a moment, that if you live in a sedentary society, you're going to be oriented towards fertility much more because you're thinking about fertility of your crops, of the land as such, and of your animals. You're not just thinking about your own fertility. So you could say that in these societies, we tend to privilege or applaud or uphold symbols of fertility that look, well, that are made to look very round and very generous. You could say that we tend to appreciate, well, round women more so than, well, slim women. Now, if you are a nomad and if you're moving, being very round, having a lot of fat, having a lot of body weight will not be terribly helpful to you. Because if you are moving, if you're a nomad, and if you have to have the capacity to run very fast on occasion, being this way is not going to help you. However, if you're sedentary, being this way is something that can work in your favor because it's basically the image of a sedentary life. This is something that we're struggling with nowadays because we are still sedentary, and yes, we are gaining weight on account of that. Now, this is interesting to me, although I am aware of the fact that there are hundreds of thousands of years separating the Neolithic agricultural revolution and its own cults of fertility and its own ideas of magna mater and very round, very voluptuous women. It's just an interesting analogy to compare it to this, again, very generous representation of a female body. Now, as we did it in previous two lectures, I want to go back to when this was made. So we're saying 280 to 250,000 years ago. And I want us to go through rather quickly through the developmental stage of humanity as we are talking about it. Where was our development at? What were we doing and how were we doing it? The idea is that this is the moment that we can basically call ourselves human in its almost penultimate full capacity. Why am I saying this? Well, we have this assumption that we are no longer Homo sapiens, we are Homo sapiens sapiens, which means that we are twice as knowledgeable, we are twice as cerebral as Homo sapiens. Now, I don't think this is generally accepted as a given in the archaeological or the evolutionary community. I think we can still look at ourselves as Homo sapiens, as just with that one sapiens in the appellation. The point is that we are getting to the moment of full humanity. Now, what does this mean? This is also a biological trait and not just an evolutionary trait or not just a developmental trait. This is roughly the moment where some archaeologists and evolutionary biologists argue that we could theoretically mate with these ancestors, meaning that we are no longer different species, meaning that our bodies are very similar or actually exactly the same as theirs are. When we are thinking about being biologically identical to our ancestors, this is roughly as far as we can go. And I think we mentioned this previously, that we can go back, according to some people, 200,000 years, according to some others, 300 or 315,000 years in the past, and we will see humans that are anatomically, biologically, physiologically identical to us. Of course, given specific geography, they may be smaller, they may be larger, their skin may be of different color, but all of these are irrelevant. We're still of the same species, and we can successfully mate, which makes us of one species. So what is different here? These are the things that are important. Again, like in the case with the previous entry, we are talking about society that is most definitively using fire. So this is by no means a question at the moment. We are definitively bipedal. We walk on our hind legs. We definitively are using tools, by this moment, fairly advanced tools, and we have very large brains. Now, this is an important thing because we said that the development of our brains was accelerated greatly by adoption of fire. I think adoption is more adequate than invention. I don't think we truly invented fire. But yeah, we adopted it and we learned to master it. And then we used the fire to cook our meals. This was one of the first signs of civilization. So much so, in fact, that Claude Lévi-Strauss, a famous structural anthropologist and a structuralist, and overall great influence in the world of humanities, he made this enormous study called Raw and Cooked. So epic, large studies, basically dividing societies alongside what we could consider some sort of civilization and what we could consider like basic primitivism, savagery. So it was if we eat our food raw or if we cook it one way or the other. So by this moment, we are definitely using fire. We are definitely cooking things one way or the other. And we have large brains. Now, the idea was that our brains developed extremely fast, rapidly, I mean in terms of evolution, between 800,000 years to 200,000 years. And again, some people take 300,000, some people take 200,000. It really isn't that important. But the point is that the moment where we are here, when we are discussing this particular Venus figurine, we have our brains fully developed. And this is basically as much as they will ever be developed. Now, we have this slow emerging of what is considered humanity, or what we can call human in the largest sense of the term. When you say Homo sapiens, it's really kind of like a scientific man. It's a man that knows things. It comes from Latin, sapere, like what is to know. So, knowledgeable man, rather. Perhaps not scientific. That's a bit of a harsh statement, but a knowledgeable man, the man that knows. The man that is defined by what he can know, what he can learn. Now, it's an interesting thing for us to discuss here is that we see a different idea of what is a woman that is directly related, I would say, to this particular stage of development, because we are talking about, and this is the first time we're talking about this, full humanity and what that means, what that can be. So we can say that in interpersonal relationships were, I guess, different depending on how human we are. And depending on how much we could consider ourselves humans to versus of how much we could consider ourselves animals. I think these are important things to consider. Now, this is something that also has to do with tools and our usage of tools. And it has a lot to do with how we use those tools and how we decide to act on the world around us, which then again takes us back to this whole idea of levels or degrees of separation from nature, that we decided to separate ourselves from nature more and more, and that we decide to work on that nature more and more. Now, when I say separate ourselves from nature using tools, this is a very precise thing. I'm not necessarily only talking about separation from nature on this very abstract level. It's like we've lost connection with nature and all of it. I am talking about the physical separation from nature. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, let's say that you want to dig a hole in the ground and you have no tools. So what are you going to do? Well, you're going to use your hands, obviously. You're going to dig in with your fingers, with the palms of your hands, and you're going to make a hole in the ground. And this is something you perfectly can do. It's not very pleasant, but it's feasible. Now, this is you basically touching the soil using your fingers, using your tactile, organs, really, to act upon the world. If you decide to use a tool, let's say you have a shovel at your disposal, and you say, well, I'm not going to get my hands dirty, I'm not going to have earth under my nails, I'm not going to risk breaking a nail or cutting myself on a stone or whatever, so I'm going to use a shovel. And of course, it's going to be much faster, it's going to be much easier. And you're going to do it, with greater facility. But you've lost something in this. You've lost direct contact with the soil. You are not touching the soil anymore in all its complexity that can have insects and pebbles and plants or roots of different plants. God knows what you can find in the soil. A lot of animals, for example, field mice or groundhogs or what have you. You're kind of eliminating the element of surprise there. So you're not going to be dealing with insects, with earthworms and whatnot. You are going to be touching basically the handle of a shovel, and you're physically going to be in touch with, imagine it's a wooden handle of a shovel, so you're touching wood instead of touching soil in all of its complexity. Now, you have gained facility, but you have lost complexity of that experience, and you have lost immediacy of that experience. You are not basically acting on the world as it is. You are doing it through an intermediary proxy tool. Now, you can say that we're doing the same thing. As our civilization grows, we separate ourselves from nature more and more. We've taken this example before when we were talking about what is art in that particular courses. Hegel takes this example when he's talking about Odysseus and how he made his own marriage bed, how he made a bed for himself and his queen. Despite of the fact that he was a king and that he could have a servant do that, he wanted to make his own bed because he wanted to act upon the world in which he was living. And this is a very important thing. And this happens when we start using tools, this kind of separation. Now, some of these things are necessary. You can't really use your fingers to etch a stone. I mean, you just can't. They're too soft. Stone is too hard. You have to use a tool, which means that your experience of humanity is limited to a certain extent. If you want to make a statue out of stone, well, you have to use some kind of a tool. It's just not going to work any other way. You can't have this immediate experience of art if you're not using some kind of a tool. I guess you could make a statue out of clay, but then that statue is not going to be quite as durable as the one that's made of stone. So there are limits to how much you can do without tools. But the idea is that a tool then becomes sort of a prothesis. It becomes sort of an extension, but also a crutch. And you are extending your capacity that you have as a human, but this extension comes at a price. You substitute, immediacy and complexity of experience for ease and functionality. So something is lost so that something could be gained. And all of this is interesting because we are, again, talking about the artifact, again, not really a work of art, but an artifact that comes at the moment when we're talking about full humanity, Homo sapiens. And we're talking about this because we define humanity, as we said previously, amongst other things, by usage of tools. This is a very important thing. Now, this is all a context for us to properly analyze this particular artifact, because we are saying, okay, now we no longer have this, how should I put this, not just contextualization, but handicap in a way. We no longer have to position this in a certain category where we are saying, okay, but this was not created by hominids, if you will, that are fully human. So we have to take that into account. No, now we say this was created by a creature that is, for all intents and purposes, identical to us, at least biologically speaking, evolutionary speaking. Of course, it has much more primitive tools. It doesn't have, nearly the complexity of a society that we have, but it may have a much more complex view of the world. It may have she or he may have a much more complex and layered understanding of nature and of natural processes. Perhaps they can wield much more information than we can, although their information wouldn't come from many different types of coffee that exist, or many different cars or types of cars that exist, or things of that nature. Perhaps their complexity of info would come from being able to recognize all the different plants, knowing which berries are poisonous and which are nutritively dense, which one tastes good, which one tastes, bad, knowing which mushrooms they can eat, and all sorts of things. Being able to predict the weather, being able to read the tracks, and all sorts of knowledge that are all sorts of, skills that are lost to the industrial age. But all of this needs to be said because we are looking at this body in a very different key. We are looking at this body from a very different point of view. Now, what is to be said about this is that this particular statue is much more voluptuous than the previous one. The previous one was also, fairly thick, but not with this sensual dimension added to it. This is very important because this is a rather sexual or sexualized depiction of a female body. Now, we have the curves, we have the fat. We can talk about the fat here, and we can say that we can read the development of consciousness from this, because we are talking about the advent of differentiation. We're talking about the progress of differentiation between general context of existence. Now, how does this work? Well, we said that the first one, the first item we analyzed was just the face, nothing but the face, and it's impossible to say if this face was male or female, animal or human. Then the second one was clearly the body of a woman, or, I guess perhaps not as clear as this one, but it's the body of a woman that then didn't have a face, but wasn't terribly sexual. It was just a woman. Okay, and now we're coming to a woman as a sexual figure. I wouldn't say sexual object. That would have a completely different meaning. But we are coming to, sensual representation, and we are attaching this aspect to the general idea of femininity. So when we're thinking about what a woman is, we're thinking about the role of sex and the role of, its position in the society and in our imagination. Now, we can say that this advancing of differentiation of the idea of what is a woman has to do with general advancing of human consciousness and general advancing of, well, human species, really. Now, this also takes us back to analyze of how natural this whole thing is, because we say, okay, but then if this is a sexual representation, a sexual depiction, then that is not less natural. That is, in fact, more natural. There is nothing more natural than sex. But also, if we are to think about the term sex, it comes from Latin, which is secare, which means to cut. The whole idea of sex is differentiation. It's separation. Section also comes as a term from this particular word. It's this idea that sex differentiates. This is why in our language we have this idea of two sexes, because we differentiate through sex. And the fact that this is a sexual figurine, that it looks, well, voluptuous, and that it's, I would dare say, erotic to a certain extent, I mean, slightly, it's an important fact to address. And it's just different from the previous one. We can say that these all things are connected. The advancement of human agency, of willingness to act on nature, to separate ourselves from nature, to better define the world, to position ourselves in the world, and to have a better perception of the world. We can see how this grows. And we can also say that there is then a connection between the level of aggression, of being aggressive to a certain extent, and sex as such. This takes us back to Freud, as is often the case, where he claims that sex is violent and all sex is violence, and that all violence is sexual to a certain extent. That we have these traits grow in humanity. And now there is a whole very interesting line of inquiry. We don't really have the time nor the means to do it here, but that you can analyze the growth of aggression in humanity. That you know that many animals don't kill themselves. They can have competitions, they can have battles, they can establish dominance and whatnot, but they don't really go quite as far as to kill one another. I'm not sure if it ever happens, or if it does, I'm sure it happens rarely. But we know, sadly, that humans will kill one another very often. We engage in wars. There's like rules about how, to do war and all of it. Now, what is interesting about this is that we have archaeological evidence of possibly the first murder that was committed, and goes back hundreds of thousands of years in the past. But the point is that there is this assumption that with growing consciousness, with growing differentiation, with growing sexualization, therefore, we also have the growth of aggression. That is something that is, you could argue, not really natural if it's turned towards your own kind, but natural to a certain extent if it has a purpose and if it has an actual goal. So you could say that it's quite natural for a lion to chase after a zebra or some other prey animal, and then to violently murder that said animal because he needs to eat to survive. But I think humans have different ideas on when it's okay to be aggressive, but not to get into that now. Now, we were talking about, the face and the body and how they come together, and how we were talking about a certain dichotomy being present between these two. This was the previous lecture, and how we have both, very rudimentary, but still we have them here. Now, this is also to underline what we were previously talking about, the heightened level of differentiation and greater capacity to observe the details. Now, you could say that this face, it starts having a face, is still quite rudimentary, but there's a definitive growth in our perception and in our willingness to then repeat that, shape that we are able to recognize, that we want to create it now. Now, this takes us rather actually to the open question when it comes to this particular object that I think is an ongoing discussion in the archaeological community and the history of art community. And this is basically about the usage of this particular object, this proto-work of art, if you will. Is it symbolical or is it utilitarian? Now, this is a very important thing, and this basically then jumps straight to the 20th century and to conceptual art, and the idea of what is art, and Kossuth and Heidegger, and how they come together. But this idea that we either have this object be an applied art, I mean, again, applied art from our own perspective, that we are applying to a period that has nothing to do with our worldview, or is it symbolical? Is it representative? Now, if it's symbolical, if it means something and it exists to mean and to represent, then we can argue about its fetishistic usage. We can argue about it being, well, a fetish, or an idol, or, well, an image that has the certain capacity for the sacred. So that is one thing. The other thing is the fact that this may have been practical. We may have used it as a tool or a weapon or some other thing in that line. And yeah, this has been a discussion, looking at this object, analyzing if it had the shape that it did, not because it stood for a voluptuous female body, but because it was useful in some specific way. I do think that even people who advocated for this particular position, that it was practical rather than symbolical, accepted that not all of the object can be explained as utilitarian, that not all of it is practically useful, that at least part of it had to be symbolical in its representation. Now, this is something that is, well, quite important, because in a contemporary, and I would say post-19th century perspective, we do make a big difference between pure art, fine art on one end, and applied art on the other. And we tend to think that applied art is a completely different thing. So it's something that is implied to be of lesser value, though recently we're trying to balance this out. But yeah, that it's just not the same thing. It's not made for the same purpose. Now, the problem with this, obviously, is that this object is made so long ago that we don't really have any way of establishing. We can only assume, and we can only speculate. But the whole idea is that we do not know, but we are discussing it, we are talking about it. Now, there's another thing that is very close to this particular discussion, is that a certain line of researchers imply that this is not a woman at all, that all of these things that we said are basically not at all truth. So they see either a phallus, which is quite interesting, or a penguin, of all things. Yeah, I know this is really weird if you're thinking about what are the penguins doing in this part of the world. We know that they're mostly situated in the South Pole, and this is, something that is to be addressed. But yeah, there are researchers that claim that this may be either a penguin or a phallus, or it can be a woman. Now, I find this to be very interesting. Well, not like the ridiculousness of, penguins, but I do think that some kind of penguins did exist, I mean, many hundreds of years ago, in this particular part of the world. So it's not that ludicrous of an assumption. But what I do find interesting is that this whole possibility of it being a phallic figure, of it being a phallus, and the fact that we're calling it a Venus. Now, why do I find this so interesting? Well, this is something that we're going to be talking about later once we get to the cult of Aphrodite and the birth of Aphrodite. Now, Aphrodite in Greek myth comes from castration of Uranus. Kronos, god of time, castrates god of heaven, and heaven itself, Uranus, throws his genitals into the Mediterranean Sea. They resurface on the Isle of Cyprus, and waves mold them into a body of Aphrodite. This is incredibly Freudian, like 100% Freudian. The whole idea that we were talking about differentiation is kind of, well, flipped on its head, because we have, well, a penis, which belongs to men in most cases, being turned into a woman, and not just any woman, a goddess of sex. Again, you have the term sex having to do with separation, so it's interesting that we're talking about castration here, but we also have something that is the male principle, patriarchal, if you will. So penis belonging to the god of heaven, which is the first initial great god for the Greeks, the highest authority, if you will, is turned into Aphrodite, which is, again, the premise of what will later become Roman Venus. And we can say that even when cult of Aphrodite was imported from the Middle East, that the early priests of Aphrodite would castrate their opponents on the battlefield. So there was this idea, a connection between castration and what would then later become the cult of Aphrodite. Now, this is quite interesting for us to think that this may be a phallus and not a voluptuous woman. And it's really this whole idea of a connection between male and female, which is, again, very Freudian. But there is yet another assumption that I find very interesting personally, that this goes right at the heart of my research. And this is the assumption that this may be all three things at the same time. Now, we're going to get to this when we start talking about Ishtar, the queen of the night, a Babylonian relief that is most interesting. And when we start talking about the Egyptian Sphinx, when we talk about, let's say, the Minotaur or the Centaur, or all these hybrid theriomorphic creatures. If you think about the Griffin, or if you think about, Pazuzu, or any other Egyptian deity that is half human, half animal, half human, half falcon, or half ibis, or whichever other bird or other animal in question. This is a very important thing, and it's basically this whole idea of connection between, again, humans and nature. That on one end, we are following this linear development of differentiation, of separation from nature, of more and better and more complex perception of the world. So on one end there is that, but on the other end there is this constant returning to nature, like a cyclical I wouldn't say line if it's cyclical, but a cyclical motif in development, let's put it that way, that is very Nietzschean, and that is then later very much Jungian and very much in line of Mircea Eliade and his studies, this whole myth of the eternal return. Now, you could say that this is really the case here, that we have these initial figures, obviously, at least the second and the third one, obviously being human, but then they may not be human at all. They actually, the third one may be a bird. Penguin, to my knowledge, is a bird. Or it may be a phallus. So we have this opposite tendency, opposite to differentiation. We have basically them being indifferentiated. We have male and female being brought together. We have human and animal being brought together. So while we can observe that this is more differentiated than the previous item in our discussion, it may actually be less at the same time. And this is really interesting, especially if we think about this as a work of art. And we think that creativity, is really important in art. It's all about creating things. Well, phallus is a creative principle, but so is a woman. Woman is the most creative creature because, women make children. They don't do it alone, of course, but they do most of the work. And it's this whole idea that this particular figurine can be far more complex than we think about. Even more so if we are discussing about the possible practical purpose of it. If we are discussing about the whole thing, that it may be an applied piece of applied art, I mean, again, as anachronistic as that may sound, or it can be a symbolical depiction. Now, this whole business with differentiation or indifferentiation is very important because we could say that it's something at the very heart of our civilization, although we can't really be talking about civilization if we're talking about something that is situated 250 or 280,000 years in the past. But the whole point is that if we're talking about the functioning of some sort of a group, it doesn't have to be a civilized group, whatever methodology you use to establish if something is civilization or not, that differentiation is extremely important. Relationships within the group are very important. If they get, questioned, and if we have issues with being able to properly differentiate, then we're in trouble. And this is something that was analyzed with great success by both Freud and René Girard. So both Sigmund Freud and René Girard did excellent work analyzing what happens with societies that fall to, as René Girard says, mimetic crisis of indifferentiation. Girard talks about these occurrences where twins are born, identical twins, and this is a great scandal because you cannot fully attribute identity to one person, as is normally the case. So suffice to say that these babies did not fare very well in these occurrences. sadly, but that's how it was. This is the whole idea that this is really important in our creation of laws. It's really important in our creation of ways in which a community works. Differentiation is extremely important. And then going the other way in differentiating is also important, only in reverse. Now, we're not going to open this whole can of worms because it would take us, a very long time, but just to mention that we have this question present, and that's something we need to take into consideration when we are thinking about this object, when we're thinking about what it is or what it can be. Now, what I want to also mention is this kind of go back to the idea of this being made out of stone, a very particular type of volcanic stone. And I want to go back to this biblical idea that we mentioned in the previous lecture of God creating humans out of earth, out of soil, or out of clay, if you will. So clay or earth is one thing, and stone is another. I mean, clay, or again earth, let's say earth just to be more general, is fertile, and it can grow a lot of plants, a lot of crops, and it has this regenerative capacity. And well, we bury a lot of we bury ourselves in the soil a lot. There is this whole idea of the cycle of birth and the cycle of regeneration that has to do with burial, that we can look at the buried human body kind of like a seed that will then later sprout and give new life. So there is all of that. So when we say that man is man, humans are made out of soil, that's a deeply symbolical affair, but that is also deeply agricultural in its essence, because this is a very good clue that we are talking about agricultural society. But if we're creating statues out of stone, stones are not fertile. They don't really grow plants out of them. I mean, you can see plants growing out of stones, but that's because there's some soil or some dust clinging to those stones. So plants need soil to survive. But the whole idea with this is that the more we work on these manuports and the more we make them into statues, so less of manuports, more into statues, we are basically trying to create ourselves. And this is the idea, that we are trying to replicate the image that we have of ourselves, and that we see ourselves in nature. We see ourselves as a part of nature, and we take ourselves out of nature so that we could create ourselves. And I think that this is very important for us to understand, especially if we're talking about the tools that are used, especially if we're talking about the materials that are used, and which tool can act on which material. I think all of these are very important questions. Now, it's also something that is connected to animism, that it's the oldest kind of the system of sacred, the oldest faith, this belief that the same spirit runs through everything. Now, this may be older than animism. We have this idea that animism is about 100,000 years old. Of course, we cannot determine this with certainty, but we can assume that with these statues, that the humans are slowly starting to separate themselves from nature. Even if they're situated way before, we can really talk about animism, or at least how it's understood from this point of view. Now, I would like to think that we covered most of really important things when it comes to this statue. I don't think we've had enough time to talk about sex and sexuality and how important the sensual nature of this, the fact that this statue has legs and wide hips and all these other primary and secondary sexual characteristics, but doesn't really have arms, that she starts having a face, and we didn't really get to explain and elaborate and develop how influential this is to 20th century art, and it is. So we'll have to leave that for another time. We did not also have the time to talk about Eros and how atavistic it can get, especially how funny it is to talk about atavism in the context of a statuette that's 280 or 250,000 years old. But yeah, all of these are, very important. And it's important to note that atavism in itself has a lot to do with indifferentiation. This whole idea that we want to become animals, again, has to do with indifferentiation. So we have to wrap this up now. I thank you for your attention. I hope this all made sense. And I'm looking forward to have you in our next lecture that is going to be dedicated to the Mask of La Roche-Cotard. So until then, have a nice day and ciao.